Hello and welcome. The Department of Arts and Humanities presents to you Story Lane, an introspection of thoughts. I'm Hetvi, and on today's episode, we're going to talk about something that is very close to my heart, poetry. And I would like to welcome Mr. Abhijit, the assistant professor of our department. It's very nice to have you on here today. And so I would like to ask you about how exactly did you get into poetry?
First of all, Hetvi, I'm happy to be here. And poetry, I believe I started with the work of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and it was titled The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So it was a lesson that was taught to me by my class teacher in 9th standard, and I was very curious about how the story was proceeding. So if you're familiar with the story, it is a poem that is written in ballad form, and it talks about the adventures of a sailor in a ship, and he's recounting this story in a wedding. And the story invokes many aspects of poetry that are very contemporary to Coleridge's time, and it was a use of supernatural imagery. So poetry, you might be thinking, is it all about supernatural imagery? No. Poetry cuts across all genres.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
So, as you said, it cuts across all genres. So, can you introduce us more into the kind of themes and the kind of themes that it has gone throughout history?
Right. So, if you look at the origin of poetry, it can be attributed to the tradition of oral storytelling. So, if you could look at if you understand the prehistory, there were many adequate forms of communication that were available. So, people actually relied on telling each other stories. And if you look at the Epic of Gilgamesh, the first known aspect of poetry, we can actually say that it was part of this oral tradition, right? And this form actually went on to have very serious transformative changes over the years.
Okay, that's nice. So can you introduce us more to how poetry has developed more through history? Like, what have been the eras?
All right. So we can't just attribute poetry to be consisting of universal time zones. We can't divide it according to that. In every region, poetry acquired different proportions, and it were focusing on the concerns of the society in which poetry were being written. So if you look at the history of Greek tragedy, you might be thinking, what is the relation between Greek tragedy and poetry? It was based on the verses that were sung during the Dionysian festival. So poetry in that period were consisting mostly of the tales of mythical kings, the adventures, fights with supernatural beings, etc. But if you examine the evolution of poetry, it became about the self, it became about personal lyrics, it became about love. So if you examine the works of John Donne or Shakespeare, for example, all these people wrote during the Elizabethan age or during the crowning moments of the empire. So the empire actually gave them ideas to incorporate in their poetry. So if you could look at the images that Shakespeare, Milton and John Donne used, we can see a lot of imagery relating to travel and adventure. Because we have to understand that society during that time, it made use of maritime adventures as a major source of travel. So we can actually see the elements of Eastern countries. The perfumes of Arabia can't wash away the sins that I have. That's what Lady Macbeth said while she was washing her hands. So we can see a lot of Eastern influences in the poets of this time. And as the years passed, the personal became more dominant in the Romantic period. So if you would know the definition of poetry according to Wordsworth, it was the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. So according to the Romantic poet, it was something to behold and then recollect it and make poetry as a discourse which expressed the innermost feelings of the poet. Now, if you examine the neoclassical age, which was before that, it was used as a political tool.
Right.
If you could look at the poems of Absalom and Achitophel by John Dryden, it was an attack on his rival poet, Thomas Shadwell. So all the concerns of poetry, it changed according to years, and which were the looming concern of the society at that time, invariably became the subject of poetry.
Right, so it's always been like the general always influences the very specific.
Yes,
like
but it is not to say that there were not any personal lyrics, right? Because John Donne's work are deeply personal, but it incorporated the element of the public as well. So the famous example is, when we talk about John Donne, is a metaphysical conceit. So how does it compare two lovers? Two lovers are compared as the needles in a compass. where do you use compass? A compass is used by a person who is trying to navigate or trying to navigate the direction to a particular place.
Yes.
So it was a vocabulary, or it was a word that was prominent in the colonial age, where exploration were done in a very fruitful way. So John Donne was familiar with the fact that whole of Europe was indulging in all these explorations, and compass became a household name for that. So why not use it in poetry? That was his idea.
Okay, that is very interesting. So what are some of the themes that are very prevalent in the kind of eras that you said? For example, Romanticism or Neoclassicism.
Yeah.
What are the most important themes that we see in those kind of poems?
So the neoclassical age is said to have starting from the works of John Dryden. And John Dryden, rightly called the father of modern English literary criticism, always incorporated poems that are very political, that people could understand. And these poems were performed in public as well. But when it came to Romantic age, the concern was the self rather than what is out there. So you see something and you incorporate the emotion of what you saw in the lines. So that was the difference between Wordsworth and a person like Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope and people of the neoclassical era, they were concerned about what was contemporary and how can I address it in a poetic form. So they had a very rigid understanding of the poetic form. They always used rhymes, they always had a very strict meter to adhere to and all that. Now, when it came to Romantic age, more than the form, the emotion was given more importance. So we can actually see that in the verses of Kubla Khan, in The Solitary Reaper by Wordsworth, or even Don Juan by Lord Byron.
Okay.
So it became a verse novel in the hands of Byron. So it incorporated the use of novel, which was a major literary form that was started in 19th century, and then he made it into a novel. So it became essentially what we can call it as the first verse novel or something like that.
Okay, now that we've talked so much about the specifics of what poetry is and what it has been, why don't we dive deeper into why we need to study poetry? Because it's in all of our syllabus, and many students have been questioning it. Why exactly do we need to learn poetry?
Okay.
So can you tell us more about that?
Right. So your question is very valid here. So why not express the same content in a fiction form, like a short story? Or why not a novel? Or why not a novel? So the good thing about poetry, or rather its important feature, is about how you can play with language and how we can use language to create emotion. Now, in your second semester syllabus for additional English, you might be encountering two poems which are rather not very positive in its theme. So people generally attribute the idea of beauty or goodness while talking about poetry, but the same lines or the language, it can be used to convey any type of emotion.
Yes.
So the first poem that I want to address here is Scream by Jayanta Mahapatra.
Yes, we're doing that right
Yes. So what kind of emotion did you feel after reading that?
Well, at first it took me a while to understand what it was, but then I could interpret the pain that I was talking about, the very extreme feelings that one feels, which is very constant, as the poem talks about.
Okay.
It is something that one cannot, completely escape. So that was that is what we learned till now.
Right. So the emotions of fear and anguish that is there in the lines of Jayanta Mahapatra, it can be conveyed using a short story in the form of a news piece or any other literary form.
Even an article or an essay.
Exactly. And he is talking about a universal theme of suffering. And the idea here in poetry is that how you play and make use of the English language. So the beauty inherent in every poem is not just because of the theme it says, but has an additional influence of the language as well. The way you use language and words sparingly. Earlier we had a discussion about the importance of sentence in poetry, and we were talking about how we can create a beautiful effect through an economical use of words. So in very simple terms, poetry is essentially that. With very short sentences or phrases, we are creating a lasting impression on the mind of the readers. The novel and the short story can also create that, but the poem has the attribute of making it very spontaneous. You are actually reading it and you're feeling the emotion then and there. Novel or a short story might require an explanation, but a poem, because of its immediate nature, it can invoke a certain emotion as fast as possible in the minds of the reader compared to
Right, because it's like in a shorter form.
it's not necessarily that, because the word length are very similar. It's not in the form of sentences. But again, I am coming back to the idea of a verse novel here, because people like Vikram Seth, they have been experimenting with the idea of verse novel for quite some time. So it's an entire novel that is written in the form of a verse.
Yes,
Yeah.
that reminds me of Dante's Inferno.
Yes.
Like the whole book is just his verses.
Yes, even
that
if you
talks
look at
about-
Indian history, Mahabharata is also a
Yes,
form
the
of
whole
poetry.
thing is just
Yes.
poetry.
Yes.
Okay, so can we talk about how exactly do you interpret and teach
Okay.
students poems? Like, what do you prefer to focus on while teaching poems?
Okay, so there is a very interesting book written by the literary theorist Terry Eagleton, and the book's title is How to Read a Poem. Now, we might be attracted to a poem thematically because it can be an experience that we might have gone through and we might relate to that. Or we might look at the language in which the poet has written and we might resonate with that more. So, according to Eagleton, the literary criticism or the way in which we should analyze a poem depends on both these factors. That is the beauty of the language and the emotion that particular poem invokes. So, we need to address these two emotions, and we just need to create an impression like that. Yeah.
Okay, so is there any specific poems or pieces that you would like to recommend to our audience to read to like feel anything like specific?
Right. So for the audience, I would recommend the poem of W.H. Auden. It's titled Epitaph on a Tyrant. And it only has 5 or 6 lines, but the emotion that poem creates within you, it is something more than what a novel or a short story can actually create. So with short bursts of words, we can actually create a lasting impression in the mind of the audience.
Right.
Because the challenge of poetry is that you do not have an infinite canvas. You can't write the pages endlessly. You have to restrict yourself somewhere. And the beauty of poetry is that a complete emotion is invoked in the mind of the reader or mind of the listener, because poetry is performed these days.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was very interesting. Thank you so much for conversing with me, and I learned so much from this, and it was such a pleasure to have you on here. And thank you so much to all of you for tuning into this episode.